You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Hi everyone, welcome to Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, Star Trek The Next Generation podcast, hosted by myself, Jay Reckward, and my father, Jake Reckward. This podcast is being recorded for the benefit of my son, Ben, but we know there's so many great Star Trek fans out there that we're putting all these episodes out for free on YouTube. How are you doing tonight, Jake?
I'm good, Jay, and you?
I'm excited. Tonight we are reviewing Star Trek The Next Generation Season 3, Episode 11, The Hunted, which debuted on January 8th of 1989 with a star date of 43489.2. This is, I think last episode I talked about how The Defectors felt really short because the pacing of it is very solid, and the storytelling is very tight all the way through. I think the storytelling in The Hunted is even tighter, and in many ways, the episode goes by very, very quick. I watched it 3 times in preparation for tonight's episode, and by the third time, and I watched it twice in preparation with Ben. I was just sitting there, kind of startled by how quickly we get from the crew of the Enterprise trying to leave Angosia all the way back to this kind of veteran rebellion that takes place at the end. And for 45 minutes, it really does feel like 20, but I think part of that is because of how tight the storytelling is, how solid it's become. And one of the things I think about season 3 that we've seen is that these stories are much more contained, and there are many varied narratives taking place, but one of the things I think is really helping the quality of these episodes is the editing. There's a real tightness to, like, when scenes end, when the story changes direction. I think just in general, structurally, these shows have gotten so much better from definitely season 1, but even from season 2. I think that they're just better shows.
A couple comments real quick. I'm glad you brought up editing because that's something, I look at the story, but don't think necessarily about what it takes to produce, a television show like this. So I think your point about how the producers edit, what material they have is important. The other thing, just that I've said before, is, this is science fiction. But at the same time, these stories are just very much about human things, and
Hmm.
the stories really about how veterans are treated. And just to say, for Ben and those who are listening, it's very interesting that the timing of this is that we're doing this podcast for this episode, The Hunted, on Veterans Day, November 11th,
Hmm.
2021, which is, a holiday in the U.S. to um, pay respect to those who served in the military, and particularly those that gave their lives. And I guess they do that in other countries, since, the Remembrance Day in the
Hmm.
UK, and they do something in France because it all goes back to the ending of World War One.
Yes, yes, they do. In fact, many countries after one interesting kind of phenomenon that's happened in the 19th and 20th centuries is that a lot of countries that developed their own independence developed remembrance holidays for the end of Great Wars, and a lot of Europe just has a lot of holidays celebrating the end of World War I and World War II. I don't know how they handle it in the Asian countries that were affected by the World Wars. I don't know if Japan has any holiday commemorating the end of World War II. I know China had something under Mao that commemorated the end of the Japanese occupation, but I don't know if they still celebrate that.
I don't
Just
know. Yeah, right.
but um, I think it's important that we are recording this on Veterans Day, and you know, on one hand, I think getting into this episode, the narrative in itself is short, but I think the subject that we're going to dig into is very deep and very rich, but also very difficult because, from an American perspective, we've both been raised with this idea that one of the great strengths of our country is our military, made up of our citizenry, a volunteer force that, in previous generations were drafted, however. But a volunteer force of people from all walks of life with the idea that we are the best trained, best equipped, um, and that we conduct ourselves with a level of honor and sophistication that kind of outstrips the rest of the world. And this popular narrative, I think, is one that is so ingrained within American culture that when we actually see the stark realities of how veterans are treated in this country, not even you and I have talked about Vietnam a lot this season, and kind of how maybe the '80s were a reaction to Vietnam, but even going back to World War II, the treatment of veterans in this country, especially veterans in the Black and Brown communities, have not been sterling in terms of um,
Oh,
its reputation.
I don't think the treatment of veterans from Afghanistan and Iraq, regardless of
Oh
race,
yeah.
has been that good. I mean, on NBC News tonight, they talked about Veterans Day and that there were, over 7,000 servicemen and women killed in those
Hmm.
wars. But since 9/11, 30,000 former military have taken their lives because of PTSD or just not being able to adjust back to the real world.
Well, we also have to highlight, here on Veterans Day, um, there is there are 1.4 million veterans here in America at risk of homelessness or homeless as we speak,
I was
and
going to
a lot
mention
of
that
this is
also. Yeah.
a lot of this has to do with the fact that despite the promise of government services and rewards for their services through the GI Bill and housing subsidies and educational subsidies, and also our society still hasn't done much of the work to help veterans readjust to um, I guess non-wartime existence
Hmm.
here in America, which not only speaks to what we're going to be reviewing this episode, but I also think to one thing I think we're going to have to touch on tonight, and I've been debating on how we're going to discuss this, but one thing I think The Hunted highlights is how society has a very difficult relationship with the idea of violence. And how not only how we prepare for it and how we execute it, but then how we respond to it afterwards. And I think we'll get into that. But before we do, let's dig into the episode. Let's give the audience a little bit of a background to what's going on. Um, so here, let me start at the beginning. So we open with the captain's log where the crew of the Enterprise D has arrived at Angosia 3, a planet that has expressed strong desire for membership in the Federation. The Prime Minister Narok has taken Commander Riker and Captain Picard on a tour of the city. And at the conclusion of the tour, Commander Riker and Captain Picard congratulate Narok on their culture's rapid recovery from the Tarsian War, which Narok reciprocates by saying their people are equally grateful. And this is an important thing that kind of brought up my point about talking about violence. Violence of any kind is abhorrent to the Angosians, who consider art and intellectual achievement to be their greatest virtues. Um, as they are talking, one of Narok's aides pulls him aside to an urgent matter. In private, um, Picard takes this moment to comment how the Ingosians will make a fine addition to the
Hmm.
Federation's membership. Riker agrees, though he finds the Ingosians on Ingosia 3 very stuffy. Nayrock returns and immediately requests Picard's help that because an Ingosian prisoner has escaped from the penal colony of Lunar 5 in a stolen transport vessel. Ingosian security has tried to track him, but frankly, they are not trained to do this, and the Enterprise is basically uh, requested to help recover this prisoner. Um, that's kind of catching up to where we are. Some just little details here. Prime Minister Nayrock is played by the fantastic James Cromwell, who is a very renowned American actor who's played many villainous roles.
Is he
Sorry, go on.
Cromwell or Crowell? I don't know if there's an N in his
Um.
name.
Oh, I'm sorry. It might be Crowell.
Yes.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I don't want to. James. Is it James Crowell?
Yeah. You don't want to get you don't want to get Ephraim Cochrane's alter ego wrong.
Oh no, you're right. No, you're. Wait, timeout. Actor? What happened to the actor? Okay. Yeah. No, it is James Cromwell. Yeah, no,
Okay.
his name's James Oliver Cromwell.
All
Yeah,
right.
Star Trek First Contact, L.A. Confidential.
Then I,
Yeah.
then I misspelled his names in my notes. I'm sorry.
No,
So I will keep
no, it's
that in
okay.
mind.
I was,
Yeah.
but James Cromwell's this great actor who, as I said, L.A. Confidential, multiple episodes of Star Trek. He has also been in The Green Mile, Space Cowboys. Just a prolific actor with years of successful experience and film credits to his name. He, as you mentioned, he will play the future Zevram Cochrane, who is the creator of the warp engine that later draws the attention of the Vulcans and initiates first contact, which eventually leads to the creation of the Federation. Um, Very cool to see him here. I've always thought that this actor was he always just plays a very good villain because uh, I think some I think one thing you need to have a good villain, especially if they're the prime minister character or something like that. Like they have to have a real sense of being a patrician about them. And I've always thought that James Cromwell had a very kind of patrician manner to him.
He does. Yes. Now, the one thing
Yeah.
you just said is that you described. Well, just make a note of this. You described him as sort of a villain. Do you really see him as a villain in this episode? I mean, he kind of
So,
he starts out as being like you said that Picard and Riker would say, "Oh, they make a great, addition to the Federation." And Riker kind of says, "Ah, but
uh,
they're a little too stuffy." And then, as things come out, it's like you guys need to think about things a little different. So I don't think he's as much a villain as he's as the leader of the society of the planet. Like you guys have
ooh,
gotten you guys have gotten crossways with some things here.
ooh, we're gonna have a real big discussion tonight. Then, okay, so, uh, let's talk about this now since we're here. I think there's a question when you deal with the idea of villainy. You have to separate the idea of responsibility versus complicity. So let me use a real world example. Um, who was the first person you were able to vote for? Do you remember for president? You didn't. You weren't able to vote for Johnson. Like you were too
Oh,
young.
George McGovern,
But the
1972.
Vietnam. Yeah. So Vietnam was over, right?
Yeah, it
Or
was Nixon versus McGovern in 72.
right. So let's say you had been born around the time of Vietnam, and you voted for a president that sent all these troops. Do you know what? Vietnam's a bad example. Here, this is a good example. Um, let's say a U.S. government is voted into power, and After a terrorist attack one September one year, they decide they are going to invade a country that they believe is a threat to their interests in the region. And in the process of doing that, they create a story that involves weapons of mass destruction, chemical warfare, and the acquirement of equipment needed to create these said weapons of mass destruction, and they pin it on one specific regime. We later find out through a review of the sources, other international groups going in and actually investigating the region in question, that many of the claims made by that U.S. power were fraudulent. So everyone who votes for that president again in 2004, knowing that there is a fraudulent war going on, you have to ask, okay, who's the villain in this? It's very clear to me if you look at the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts, the main villains to me I will always pin on George W. Bush and Vice President Dick Cheney. One's the commander in chief, and the other one was one of the basic architects of it. Those two are villains because they are intentionally creating a situation where human life and suffering will increase. I mean, human suffering will increase, and human lives will be decreased because of that. But what about the people who vote them into power and keep voting them into power and keep believing that the war is a just thing and argue that the loss of American troop life, but also the loss of Iraqi life, is justified because it is leading to a greater good? Or, as Picard will later say, and I wanted to get this line because it really is kind of a matter of internal security, the age-old cry of the oppressor. Um, we we went out of our way in the name of national security to create a conflict that led to untold human suffering that we're still dealing with today. The point that I'm trying to get to is that there's very clear villains in this, but there's also a large community of people, us the voters, that are complicit in this. We as a society, and this gets to the main crux of the episode, The Hunted, we as a society enter wars and conflicts where we create the means and tools needed to win these wars, and then afterwards we take no responsibility for the damage we create in the creation of those responses. You can say that maybe Nayrock is not a villain, but he knows that he is instrumental in putting all of those veterans on the penal colony of Lunar 5. Everyone in that room is responsible for doing that, and they all use the justification of, like, well, the people voted for it. But sometimes what the people do or what the masses decide isn't moral and isn't ethical. So, to the question of do I think he's a villain? Yes, I think Nayrock is a villain. I think most of the people at the end of that episode in that room are villains, but do I think the majority of our Angosians are villains? No. I do think they're complicit, just like we're complicit.
My comments are, it's a little bit as an apples and oranges comparison because I actually agree with your description of the Bush Cheney administration and how they created the situation that led to the Iraq War, which was in March of 2003. So the election was the next year. I'm not sure, I don't remember when Americans really became aware that the whole
2006.
Well, so that was after the
But we
2004.
knew beforehand. But the UN was going in beforehand with their
Oh,
teams and not discover.
it was the International Atomic Energy Commission or whatever it
Yeah,
was.
but like we already knew beforehand, well before boots were touching on the ground, that there were no WMDs.
And I think that the other thing that you kind of brought up to some
And
extent.
no offense, I have to stop for a second.
You're
And like
right.
he just died, and I don't mean to be disrespectful to him in any way, but like Colin Powell went in front of the international community, held up a vial of anthrax, and said that this
Well,
was a threat.
yes,
When we later found out that that was concocted as well.
and I think if we could talk to Colin Powell's ghost right now, he would say, "I was too good a soldier.
Right.
I followed orders." But
Absolutely.
getting back to this, I think that the real villainy of uh, Bush, George W. Bush, and Cheney, and uh, I
Paul
forget his name,
Wolfowitz and
Paul Wolfowitz, right? The neocons was their, um, their assumption without any real good evidence that people in the Middle East, in Iraq, were ready for a, a democratic government where they had no understanding, they had history of that, and to try to force that on them to nation build resulted in the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives. And we talked about this, I think, the last episode, how that created, um, ISIS and so on.
right.
I mean, it goes back to we really fucked up the Middle East, starting with
Oh yeah.
creating the Mujahideen.
Oh,
Um,
Dad. By all arguments, we have done more damage to that region of the world than
yes.
British imperialism or European
Oh,
imperialism
I
ever
would,
did.
I would agree. Now, coming back to Angosia, where I would, kind of qualify Nayrock as a villain. I'm thinking about, well, how did this happen? They had this war. They created these super soldiers,
Mm-hmm.
um, and the war's over. So then they have the issue of how do we integrate these people that we've altered back into civil society? And they didn't have an answer for it. It says, okay, we'll put them on this moon. So I'm not sure, they may have the intent that this would be a good place for them to live. And the question is, did they really think it was a good place to live, or was it a penal colony from the start? And that's where, once people like Danar, Roga Danar, and these super soldiers were put on Luna 5, they very quickly realized that since they were not going to be supported, they were not going to be trying to be rehabilitated at all. It really ended up for them very quickly understanding, like, shit, they've just pushed us aside. This is the same as a penal uh, uh, colony, and this is very unfair. And the last point
Well,
is
as Picard says, no matter how comfortable the prison, it is still a prison.
right. And the only thing, again, sort of to defend Nayrock as not being a total villain is, and we'll get into more detail about this, is when the episode ends and Picard leaves them to sort it out. It puts, he kind of leaves them where um, uh, Roga Danar and his compatriots, they'll only get aggressive if they feel they're threatened. So
Yes.
Picard was able to de-escalate the confrontation and put Nayrock and the leadership of Angosia 3 in a position that you can do things different. You can start to make some amends with these people now. And you don't know how it turned out, but I
Yeah.
mean, so
Which I would love to know,
right,
really, as a
exactly,
fan.
exactly. So
Well,
that's the only comments I wanted to make.
I think it gets into the larger question of so getting back to the story, and this will kind of frame where the discussion goes a little bit, and kind of how I want to respond. Um, the Enterprise tries to recapture Roga Danar. And I have to say, one of the more thrilling sequences I've ever seen on the show. Like the entire process of them trying to of Data trying to capture Roga Danar and Roga Danar slipping it out through his drive section and then slipping onto the Enterprise and then finally being captured that way. Some of the most thrilling filmmaking I've seen on the actual show itself. It made one of the criticisms sometimes have of I sometimes have of the show is that when they have space battles or interactions with the ship in the 90s, they didn't have the kind of CGI technology where people could be flying around and stuff. They didn't really have that until Deep Space Nine. Um, what they did here is just really brilliant. Just simple little movements, having the models go around an asteroid, but the use of pacing and the music, just great.
Hmm.
But he sneaks onto the ship, and they finally capture him, and they're ready to transfer him back when, walking down the hall, Counselor Troy, using her empathic betazoid powers, senses Roga Danar in the midst of a post-traumatic episode. And through the discussion with him, discovers that he is in fact a enhanced soldier or a super soldier created by the Argosians to fight their battles during the Tarsian Wars, and that his escape, which involved the murder of three Argosian security forces, I believe, um, has put him in a state where he fears for his life, both on the grounds that he does not want to return to his prison, but at the same time he cannot allow himself to be captured, essentially. Um, I think the difficulty of this subject is that at the end of the day, we are talking about using humans to do terrible things and then never reckoning what we've done to those humans. And in many ways, we never reckon in doing what we do to turn those humans into killing machines, what we in turn do to ourselves in the process of that as a society. Because to make the agreement that, I think to make the philosophical agreement that we are going to psychologically and physically engineer people to be killing machines with the idea that we're going to send them out to the battlefield and wreak wanton human destruction. Um, I think that you have to lose a large amount of empathy within yourself to do that. I think that you have to quote Charlie Chaplin, I think you have to take on machine mind thoughts and have a machine mind heart. Um, I think anytime society gets into the machinations of war, you start having to give up things that make you human just to do it. And the thing about this episode, and I kind of wish that we had more context, we don't really know what the Tarsian War was about,
Right.
or if, because the Angosians want to enter the Federation as a new member, which means that they're warp capable, and they are able to at least leave their system enough to create trade. And we even see Argosian ships. Um, Without the context of what the actual Tarsian War is, it's very hard to kind of qualify what was done to Roga Danar and his compatriots because we don't know what kind of hell they were sent into, but we
Well,
know it's the kind of thing that required them to be physically and psychologically altered on a very deep level.
it's sort of like a Jason Bourne type thing, but
But
they,
but
but
on a much different on a
well,
different level because you had to
well, yeah,
genetically alter these
right. Because
individuals.
one of the reasons that they can't find him on his scanners, they don't identify their the scans don't identify Danar because he's not picked up as a life form which is later understood that he and the other soldiers had been programmed. And I think at one point Dr. Crusher said something about their their genetics being changed. And I think it just comes back to where we're talking about. This episode points out, in I don't know about. It's interesting to think about. We there were probably, I mean, in the Civil War and the First World War and the Second World War in Korea and so on, you know, there's been an increasing recognition or understanding of the psychology and psychiatry behind what happens to soldiers when they're put in,
Hmm.
when they go through a war, PTSD and so forth. I mean, they didn't call it PTSD in World War II. They called it shell shock, I think, in World War
Hmm.
One. And the thing that you sort of bring up in this episode brings up is, society turns some of their people who volunteer or drafted into killers, and then they do not support their transition back to civil society. And I guess the thought is that once you program someone, I mean, even in the U.S. military now, particularly, you know,
Hmm.
the Marines, um, Army Rangers, Green Berets, once you program them in that direction, do you really get them all the way back? In some cases, yes, where they're functional, but what percentage of them are just not are always in warrior mode?
Well, the hard truth about all this, and it's good that you brought up the history of PTSD, and especially beginning with shell shock. Um, there, there's also been a lot of historical and anthropological study done into how society has dealt with war on a communal level, going back to the Bronze Age. Like, for example, one thing that we know that ancient Jewish armies used to do, and the army that Moses had under Joshua probably did this. After battles, the Jewish men or the Jewish warriors would not be allowed to return to the tribe. They would actually have to sit outside of the camps or the main camp for, I think, a period of days, sitting around this fire and kind of engulfed in the smoke, because there was this idea that they had committed this sin by going and killing their fellow man. That one thing in Jewish society that they have is they have a lot of these purification and ablution rituals to prepare them for entering into the temple. Warriors would have to consecrate themselves in kind of like these campfires outside the main camp before they were able to rejoin. And part of that is like helping them deal with the fact of what they did, like giving them kind of a liminal space to adjust from the idea of like, okay, you went out and did this horrible thing. You need to spend some time dealing with the fact that you did this horrible thing. And if you sit in the smoke, God will bless you and let you forgive you for what you did, and you can come back and join us.
Is it,
That is in a way of it's a very it's a
yeah.
very primitive and a very simplistic way of addressing the potential of PTSD, but it's right there. It's trying to deal with like the psychological damage of what people just did. And
giving these
we've been doing this throughout history.
giving these people a break, because just think of all of the hormonal changes when somebody's in combat in terms of
Oh,
cortisol production, adrenaline, um,
so one thing that
norepinephrine, epinephrine, and so forth.
one thing that has been a fascinating study to me is that um, we now know from Iraq and Afghanistan the amount of head trauma that troops have taken just by being in the theater during fire, just the concussive force of being
Hmm.
around munitions
Explosives.
fire.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, like, the physical toll that war takes on the body is so profound next to anything else. Um, I think one of the reasons why society kind of separates this is because we really don't know how to deal with the outcomes of war because we don't want to admit that war might be as natural it is as it is for us humans to go to war with each other. It's also unnatural for us as biological organisms to engage in it. Like the returns for let me put it a simplistic way. Dad, you and I could be standing in a room right now to each other, and we could be angry, and we could put up our fists, and we could fight each other, and hit each other, and beat each other, and like you might kick my ass and beat me, or I might kick your ass and beat you, and I might feel good for about 5 minutes, like yeah, I kicked his ass. But if we've been fighting, like really fighting, and like beating each other in 5 minutes' time, neither of us are going to feel like winners. Like, we're both going to feel like losers, and we're going to both feel the damage of what we've done to each other for days and days and days. Combat in itself is. We're. As adept as we are to kill and defend and attack and respond in militaristic and combative ways, our bodies and maybe our minds are not designed to do this at all. And I think that is a very hard truth that we keep running into. We're not designed to do this despite being very good at it.
I'm trying to think the movie, and I can't remember what it was or who the actors was, but it talked about this issue that you know nobody ever wins in a fight. I know what it was. It was. This is very kind of pop psychology, but it was in Roadhouse with Patrick
Yeah,
Swayze as the philosophical NYU philosophy major bouncer out in
right.
Missouri, which was all filmed in Southern California anyway, because we know that Missouri doesn't look like that. And
No.
and he, he's just saying, when he's building a relationship with the doctor at the hospital, he says, nobody ever benefits from a fight,
Yeah.
and, and,
Well, no,
and
that so I can speak from that from my own martial arts experience. There's the thing that no one ever tells you after the camera goes off or after the bell rings or the hands are raised or what no one tells you after the police take off their flak vests after a firefight or what the soldiers do when they take off their helmets. Everyone after a fight hurts. Hurts.
I was
We just
watching I
hurt.
was watching a little vignette on of Saving Private Ryan, and there's a
Yes.
scene that shows that is after they break through on Omaha Beach and they clear out
Yeah.
the you know the bunkers, the German bunkers, and Vin Diesel takes a Hitler Youth knife off a soldier and he gives it to one of his comrades who's a Jewish guy, and he kind of like celebrates it, and then he sits down and he puts his face in his hands and just starts crying because of the trauma of what he's just gone through. And Vin Diesel looks at him and says, and kind of looks like, what the hell? But then he has immediate understanding of what his comrade is
Yeah.
feeling.
Well, like the trauma of the trauma of combat, whether it's sports or warfare or violence in the street, is so out of place for the typical human experience that there is nothing like it. Like you and I in the modern world are not walking around with the worry of having to defend ourselves every day. Even like in the medieval era when everyone when I would argue in the Western world combat was really heavily researched, um, most people weren't having to walk around with the idea of like being knifed in the street or something like that. We live in such a safe society, and this is part of the problem with the Angosians too. We live in such a safe society that is so separated from the realities of third world violence, which I would argue is probably closer to the reality of war than anything else on an everyday scale. Um, we are so separated from it that there is a part of me that is not surprised that our veterans have reacted so poorly to this because they come from a society that just has no idea about this level of depravity.
Well,
Because that's what war ultimately is. War is ultimately depravity.
and what you point out is that we don't understand this. I mean, unfortunately, this country is slipping toward more acceptance of violence for political reasons, and not between military groups, between the citizenry. And you know, we I've got a subscription to The Economist, and after I read these magazines,
Public violence. I would
yeah,
argue
yeah,
public violence. I
public
would I would
violence.
say that the violence has always been there. It's just more public now.
So, um, and I just finished reading that Malcolm Gladwell book from 2019, Talking to Strangers, and
Right.
it has some very interesting things about um, gun culture, how that contributes to violence. We won't go on there, but going back to the Economist articles, even though we're slipping toward more common acceptance of public violence in the United States, the level of violence that exists in other countries. I mean,
It's crazy.
articles I've read about Algeria, what's going on in Ethiopia right now, what goes on in the tribal areas of Pakistan, what's happening in Afghanistan at this point, what's still happening in Syria and Iraq, what's happening in Lebanon, um, what's happening in Mexico because of the violence
Oh,
caused by the drug gangs. It's just incredible, and I think even with again the level of increasing public
Mexico
violence,
especially is especially bad.
I mean, even with the level of increasing public violence and acceptance of the concept in this country, the danger is that, well, the problem is that Americans don't realize how blessed they've been when
Hmm.
you look at, just a neighbor like Mexico and the other places we mentioned, how bad it is, and that people are probably fearful for their lives 24 hours a day.
Can I tell you two stories or two things that I've seen in my life that have put things in perspective to how disconnected Americans are?
Go ahead.
So there's this famous video. You can probably still find it online. I'm not linking it below because it is a violent video, folks. But there are these fishermen in the Sundarbans, which is this huge swampland in the area of, I think it's
It's it's
east
it's
of India.
it's
It's
Bengal. The Sundarbans are the
Yeah, it's
southwest
Bengal.
corner of Bangladesh, and it extends into India just east of Calcutta.
Right.
Since
So,
I've been to Bangladesh 5 times, but I've never been to the Sundarbans. So anyway,
well, the Sundarbans are full of tigers, and
yes.
there's this video of these four fishermen, and they're just out there fishing, and all of a sudden a tiger comes and swims up to their boat, climbs in the boat, kills one of the men, drags him into the water, swims him back to the bank. And at this point, the fishermen are swimming away, are like paddling away because they realize, oh shit, this tiger's here to kill us. Um, the tiger gets back into the water, catches up to the boat, gets back in, kills another fisherman, drags his ass back to the bank, and is about to get back in the water when he decides, no, it's too far and I have enough food. First story.
Right.
Um, the second one is a video that I watched in 2010 in a professor's office because he had been with a UN peacekeeping force in the Sudan. And it was a video of this woman and her child running at a distance across a field. And then you just see like this group of like five men running after him, and they're holding these things in their hands, and you suddenly realize they're machetes. And I've seen a video of a woman in Africa and her child um, run down by a group of men and hacked to death with machetes.
Hmm.
And that at one point was a pretty common occurrence. And that's a level of violence and cruelty and maleficence. I'm sorry, malice that here in America no one no one, for the most part, can really get their head around. I mean, even like we were just criticizing George W. Bush and Dick Cheney for going after Saddam Hussein in Iraq, but like it's not like Saddam Hussein was a saint.
Hmm.
And it's not like his sons were like good people. His sons were just as violent, if not worse. Like
Hmm.
Udain Hussein was literally torturing people every
Hmm.
day,
Hmm.
raping women and killing his best friends, and getting away with it because he had the money to do so. Like there's a part of this. I mean, if I just mention the name Joseph Kony to some people who were around in 2012, Joseph Kony is a terrorist in the Congo that raises child soldiers to
Hmm.
fight in
Hmm.
his illegal wars. Or oh, I'm sorry, my mic fell. But his illegal wars, you know, there is there's just a level of violence that the American public has no clue that takes place on an international level every day. That really it. And getting back to my point, when we started seeing soldiers from my generation dealing with PTSD in such a powerful way, it's because they were going out into a world that like it is literally the Stone Age next to. Let me put it this way: it's the difference between the Federation and the Mintakans from Who Watches the Watchers.
Hmm.
Like it's literally that the Mintakans have to live in a culture where like someone could shoot them with a bow, where like Jean-Luc Picard doesn't have to worry about someone gunning him down on his ship. It's you said apples and oranges too. Like this is apples and coconuts when it
Yeah,
comes to
exactly. Right.
violence.
Right.
It
Yes.
really is
Yeah.
apples and coconuts.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I think because we don't have an understanding and appreciation of this violence, that when it comes to our conception of violence, especially here in the modern Western world, and especially here in America, I think so much of our idea of it is dramatized to where, one thing that I have to compliment The Hunted for, um, so at one point, and this is kind of getting back to the episode, and I'll circle back, I promise. And Dad, please feel free to jump in because I've been
No, you're
talking a
fine.
lot.
Yeah.
Um, so at one point, they start investigating Roga and they discovered that the Argosians in the Teresian Wars had created these super soldiers that were biologically and psychologically, quote unquote, enhanced, to where if they were put into a situation where they were mortally threatened, they would do everything to survive. Even to the point where, it's noted that all of these enhanced soldiers will kill immediately if they think they're under threat. Um, there is one scene where, after Roga Danar breaks out during the prisoner exchange between the Enterprise and the Argosians, he sneaks into one of the cargo bays in this really kind of brilliant cat and mouse, because the majority of this episode really is kind of these cat and mouse games.
Yeah. It is. Yeah.
Um, but there's this scene where like he tries to trick Worf in the cargo bay because he sneaks into a cargo bay and Picard, and a very interesting thing that the show does a lot, uses anestetine gas to like render intruders unconscious, especially in places like the cargo bay. They did this a lot in Voyager. I just wanted to mention. Um, but Worf goes in there and with his security team, and they don't find him. And it turns out that Danar has actually hidden himself away in the cargo bay, but little does he know that Worf is onto the trick because Worf is in himself a warrior as well. And they actually engage in what I think. So I have fought. I have studied martial arts since I was 6. Um, I know good choreography, and I know what a good realistic fight looks like. The fight between Michael Dorn and the actor who plays Danar, who should be mentioned along with James Cromwell for being really,
Mm-hmm.
really good at Jeff McCarthy.
Mm-hmm.
Jeff McCarthy and Michael Dorn put on a very short but very violent and very realistic fight. It's close, it's mean. They're both hitting each other, like they're pushing each other in the stuff. Worf does a beautiful double leg takedown. I think the one part where Rogar gets away from him and then like pulls over all those crates on top of Worf, like
Mm-hmm.
that that's another the reason I'm so happy with the scene is because that is closer to real violence than not. In a real fight, people pick up things, people throw things at each other, people get knocked into things, and people fall down. You know, as I was mentioning, we dramatize fighting so much and we dramatize violence in America here so much that when you see something that is very fast and very dynamic, but also very rough and messy, like that is probably closer to what actual confrontations look like in the street versus like I think what most people think it looks like. I think television and movies, especially here in America, have really warped our view of what modern violence is. Um, for example, like one thing that I will commend this episode for doing is that they make really good use of like the phasers, not only as weapons for to shoot people with, but also as like um,
Energy
explosive
source.
devices.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
energy sources. I think like for example, one thing that they have an issue with in the UK right now is knife violence.
Mm-hmm.
Here in the US we deal with gun violence, but over in the UK they deal with knife violence because guns are illegal. Um, Everyone has seen a knife fight on TV, but no one would know how horrific a knife fight is until they got into one because we look at things like um, do I have it? I don't have it with me, but I have a knife that is designed for combat use. Now it's a lock blade, but it's the legal size that I can carry in New York. It has a 3-inch blade, which is the longest I can carry. Um, I never, despite having this knife, I never ever actually want to use it because you have to understand the nature of weapons when we talk about them. Specific weapons are designed to do specific things. Knives are designed to be quick. They're designed to be damaging. They're um, designed to be decisive. Like when you stab someone or cut someone with a knife, you're not doing a little bit of damage. You're doing a lot of damage. Um, we have this kind of, I think, fetishization of weapons that when it comes to the real, and I think this gets into the gun debate, and I know I'm kind of going all over the place here, but when we actually have a real conversation about the interaction of violence and the tools we use for violence here in America, we never have an honest one because we never want to admit that um, the things that we design reflect us, and the things that we design are inherently dangerous when it comes to war. There's no safety in weapons
Mm-hmm.
inherently. Even if you put things like safeties on them, or you put a scabbard on a sword, or you put something on a spear to make sure no one gets cut, like it is what it is. It's designed to do what it's designed to do, and we're having here in 2021 a case right now in Minnesota over a young man named Kyle Rittenhouse who shot and killed 2 people during riots in Kenosha over the shooting of a black man named Jacob Blake. Um, One reason why the case is drawing in 2021, Ben, so much controversy is because as they're actually dealing with the nature of what happened in Kyle Rittenhouse's case. They're actually having to look at, like, what were the actual interaction he had with his weapon. And one thing that we're discovering is that, like, multiple people brought weapons to that event, and every time someone used their weapon, someone got horribly injured or killed. But and but that's that's kind of the point. When people bring weapons to something, they're not doing it with the idea of, like, necessarily protecting themselves. Like, if the definition of protecting yourself is to keep your personal sovereignty whole and to keep yourself from injury,
Hmm.
um nowhere in that definition does it say that you should or want to have to kill someone else. Yet, by bringing guns into that situation, you are bringing in weapons or even bringing in a knife. Your defense you're proclaiming as what the defense you're proclaiming the need for your personal sovereignty, the option is automatically hurting someone. There is no getting around, like, I can't pull out a gun and just shoot someone and say, like, oh, they're not going to bleed, or they're not going to suffer horrific damage. Like, we've designed things that just cause damage, and then we sit there and say, well, these are the things we need to defend ourselves with. And it's like, so to defend yourself from damage, your response is to cause damage. And I think this long-winded philosophical sophistry that I just went through is a circuitous way of getting back to Roga Danar. We design soldiers to do damage and never deal with the actual damage we afflict upon them in the process.
That's a better restatement of my note on that topic. Yes, on that
Well,
issue.
like, but, let's boil down to what the real problem is here. Can you design a soldier without damaging them?
Exactly. That's that's also putting better what I had worked to state before. Yes.
But
And
but I'm asking you, do you think that we really can?
restate it again. Can we design
Do
a
you
soldier?
think that we can do you think that we can design a human soldier? Let me qualify that. A human soldier without damaging them.
No,
Exactly.
no. And I think that's one of the points here. And it actually gets into, again, on Veterans Day, it brings up the whole challenge of how if there's still a social need to have these people that can do great violence in for the benefit of a culture, the benefit of society, the benefit of a country, you know, how can you can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again.
Well, even Nayrock says it. That's what we created them for.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And I think that's the problem that we keep getting back to. Like, and I think in some ways this episode doesn't even really address it by the end when Picard decides to beam up after the veterans stage this coup, which I'm going to bring up January 6th because I don't feel like we can honestly leave this episode without talking about January 6th.
Go ahead.
Because so um as many people know, January 6th it was 2019, right? It was 2021, right?
Yeah, 2021. Yeah, this year still.
It was God, it feels so long
I
ago.
know.
So much That's the crazy thing.
Yeah.
Ben, I don't know when you're ever going to listen to this, but your pop if he's alive by the time you do, and if I'm alive, we're going to sit down and tell you how time doesn't exist.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, exactly.
yeah, this year has felt like 10 years.
It has.
Um, But on January 6th, in response to former President Donald Trump losing the election, many of his supporters believing that he had been wrongfully cheated out of the result that he desired, stormed the Capitol in Washington, D.C., and I think killed one officer and, well, I think they killed multiple people, and then one protester was shot. But the point I'm getting to about this, among the people that protested and stormed the Capitol on January 6th, the insurrectionists, because I shouldn't call them protesters, the people who tried to attempt insurrection, many of them were former police officers, and some of them were current active duty military. And a lot of people joined Trump because and a lot of former and current military service members have joined Trump because many people on that side feel that the U.S. government, doesn't matter what president it is, has led them to a great disservice. And in the process of these people being underserved and neglected, and in many times just outright rejected by our society, um, we live in a time where people will come and take advantage of those people who are suffering, these veterans, and pull them along a political path that leads to events like the ones we're highlighting here, where these veterans who rightfully have a criticism of their government, of it being neglectful and abusive of them, can quickly be co-opted into taking part in fascism under the guise of taking down a corrupt and unjust bureaucracy. One thing that I think this episode doesn't do very well with, um, it builds on this binary that there are veterans and then there are normal people. And the truth is, in the real world, and this is where Star Trek kind of fails and where it's science fiction versus the real world we live in. In America, veterans make up all portions of our society: the rich and the poor, the weak and the strong, the old and the young, black, white, brown, indigenous. Everyone in this country, from every community, has sent their children, their sons and daughters, friends and relatives, to fight and serve and protect this country. These people are our heroes. Um, At the same time, these people have been neglected by the government for so long that if someone comes along promising them respect and recognition and a chance to get back at the people that caused them their suffering, a lot of people will be psychologically inclined to follow these things because it is sating something that has been taken from within them. A lot of these soldiers and veterans who took part in the January 6th insurrection did so because they believed that their honor, and by some crazed correlation with Trump's honor, had been stolen from them. The danger of all this is that when you see veterans do this in America, it's not just that it's the working poor that feel like they've been betrayed. It's the middle class that feel like they've been betrayed. It's the upper classes. It's the black community. It's the Latino community. I have always asserted, and Dad, you've heard me say this many times through our conversations of the years. Um, I argue, you really measure a society by how well they treat their heroes, and by any standard, America has treated its heroes so poorly that we're at the advent that our heroes are willing to turn against their own sovereignty, their own citizenry, and the people that they were sworn to serve out of anger. And I think at the end of this, what Roga Danar and his compatriots, these veterans on the penal colony of Luna 5, feel is anger. Anger that they have been rejected despite volunteering to give up their lives for the betterment of others, for the defense of other people's rights and the sovereignty of their nation. They're angry that no one is out there trying to help them. They're angry that they are hurting and no one is trying to heal them. Uh, One thing that this episode really does kind of bring into perspective, and why I think Nayrock is a villain, Dad, is at one point Troy yells at one of the Angosians, the people decided that we were going to send these people to Luna 5, and that we kind of looked at the research and helping them recover, but we didn't see anything that was really there to make it feasible for us. And it's very clear that like throughout the episode, Federation technology and Federation techniques are there to help them deal with the PTSD that these soldiers are dealing with. It's just very clear that the Ngosians, or at least the non-warring Ngosians, um, basically basically just toss these people away like disposable soldiers.
Well, the one thing at the very end is that um, Danar and his compatriots say, "We're not going back to Luna 5, period."
Yeah,
I mean, they're making a stand that if they would rather be attacked and killed rather than go back to Luna 5, it just is the final expression of, we haven't been taken care of, we've been tossed aside, and we're just not going to accept that existence anymore. And that's where the episode, then sort of ends up where
existing for the sake of existing alone is not enough.
right. And that goes back to then where, Picard, uh Nayrock wants the Enterprise to send its full security force down to protect them and so forth. And, you know,
He
Picard
wants that.
yeah, Picard shows up with a very small group, and Nayrock says, "Is this all you're bringing?" And then, Danar shows up, and he Picard gets everybody to disengage, to not
Right.
have to make sure that the super soldiers don't feel threatened, so they're not going to attack anybody. So then he can speak his final piece and say, you're really basically what he tells them is that you know um, you're not ready because you have to deal with this problem that you've
Yeah.
created for yourselves. And he ends up saying to Nayrock, Picard says, "When you're ready, the Federation will be pleased to reconsider your application." And then he also, as you had pointed out, says that the Federation will provide assistance in identifying appropriate treatment for the Angosian soldiers. So it's a very sort of Solomaic position and decision action that Picard takes, where he realizes that, there's a little bit of an application of the Prime Directive here where we really can't solve this for them. They have to solve it for themselves. And they really have to figure this out before they can be accepted into the Federation, because it's a real it's if he has a checklist that he has to check off, there's one major check that Angosia 3 doesn't get here.
Yes. Or like,
And at the same time, what Picard says is, all right, as you start to figure this out, if you want our help to take care of these people, we will do it, which is a very positive thing.
well, the thing is that Picard's providing in the situation that the Ngosians can't provide for themselves is leadership. And part of that is that, like, I think the great criticism that Roddenberry is making here, or at least the writers are making on behalf of Roddenberry, because we have to remember, Roddenberry was a combat veteran of World War II. He was a combat pilot. He had actually seen time behind his aircraft, and Roddenberry had a very distinct respect and concern for veterans. And the treatment of veterans has continued to be a theme in Star Trek that has never been ignored. And I think the thing that keeps coming up in these kind of episodes is that there's real leadership that's needed if this is going to be solved. And it's the kind of leadership that looks this problem square in the eye and says, like, Picard says, these were your brothers, these were your sons, you sent them off the war and then you discarded them away. The only way we solve this is by honestly dealing with the the individuals we've made and looking at them as humans that, in some ways, the way we are looking at super soldiers, and I actually found an article from Sandbox talking about how modern super soldiers are being made across the world now,
Hmm.
and the dangers that are coming with that. You know, I think the way that we avoid things like this is that we always have to remember at the center of this, we are dealing with human beings. And I think that is the first thing that we always try to give up when we decide we are going to take part in the endeavor of creating a super soldier. Um, the entire idea that that is a human being fades away. For example, um, I wanted to bring up a list of things that are actually being done right now to
Go
possibly
ahead.
enhanced soldiers.
Go ahead.
China has done human testing to create biologically enhanced super soldiers. Um, one of the things that has been uh, researched on by not only China but our government as well. There may be an engineered blood that we are able to put into super soldiers to boost their performance. So the human body is designed for a pretty rigorous lifestyle. But there is an engineering design for a not too distant future features artificial red blood cells that can very literally give future super soldiers a leg up in competition. These artificial red blood cells, called reciprocytes, can give their users the ability to hold their breath for extended periods of time and offer a massive jump in cardiovascular endurance. These tiny machines would be made up of three parts: rotors to absorb and release oxygen, rotors to absorb and release carbon dioxide, and rotors to absorb and release glucose. In effect, the reciprocytes would do the same job as red blood cells, but far better than nature would permit. The concept is based on the work of Robert Freitas in nanotechnology research at the Institute of Molecular Manufacturing, and would offer the user the ability to hold their breath at the bottom of a swimming pool for 4 hours, or let someone sprint at top speed for at least 15 minutes without stopping to breathe. Um, Another thing that is being done today, American service members in the theater often operate with night vision goggles, also known as NVGs, but these systems offer real drawbacks. Uh, in a recent study, a University of Massachusetts medical school had injected mice with, uh, let me see, they injected mice with nanoparticles into their eyes that allowed the mice to see in the dark as effectively as a night vision goggle. On top of that, let me give you one more example. Oh, multiple armies across the world right now are experimenting with enhancing their soldiers with steroid regimens. Following one thing that I think a lot of people don't realize about super soldier programs, one of the earliest ones were actually conducted in Nazi Germany
Hmm.
using the use of anabolic steroids to see if they could improve German soldiers in the field. And to a certain extent, they did, though they weren't able to improve certain psychological things at the time because they just didn't have the proper information. But a lot of armies today are still using anabolic steroids to try
So,
to improve
so, so, so,
the athletic performance of their
so
fighters.
what you're saying here is that we're really creating you know Khan's group out of Wrath
Yeah.
of Khan.
Well, I think
This is where
with
science fiction's becoming real.
there's also the question of being able to cybernetically enhance soldiers in the future. And when you have something like Elon Musk's Linksys technology, not Linksys technology, but he has his Neuralink technology.
Hmm.
there's a real question of what is going to happen when we start putting um, computer systems and integrating them into the biological structures of our human anatomy. What happens when you start doing that with soldiers? I think a lot of these questions, when it comes to super soldiers, gets back to kind of the main criticism that I'm making here. I don't think that you can create a soldier without creating a weapon, and the moment you create a weapon, by its very design, you can't. I think the ultimate argument that like Picard is going to be making is that like no society would be doing this or should be doing this.
Well, I think the thing you're bringing up, and it goes into, you know, the Wrath of Khan, whatever his group was called, is once you create this group of super soldiers, if you don't have a
Oh, the
conflict,
augments. I'm sorry, the augments. Yeah.
if you don't have a conflict where you can use them, what do you do with them? You
Right.
find a Luna 5 to sequester them.
Or a SETI Alpha 4 or a SETI Alpha 4, SETI Alpha
or
3.
or they're going to run amok and cause a war, like happened at, I think the World War III had a lot of eugenics in it, correct?
Yes.
In
Yeah,
in,
the
in the start,
eugenics wars.
yeah, exactly. And
Well,
isn't that the same thing in Star Wars? They refer to the Clone Wars. Isn't that sort of the same thing?
so
Probably.
so interesting that you bring this up, and let's touch into that because there's a real unspoken history of oppression there. Um, in Star Wars, the issue that they have is that right before the beginning of the Clone Wars, the Trade Federation, which are the green bug-eyed creatures from Phantom Menace, they have these massive armies of droids. So they have these robotic automated armies that are kind of unstoppable to a certain extent, unless you have the Jedi. But there's even kind of the conceit that like if you point 100 rifles on a Jedi, he's not going to be able to block every laser fired at him, which is true. No one could. So the way they get around this through a secret conspiracy is that they decide to clone these super soldiers based off the bounty hunter Jango Fett, who is the father of the famous Boba Fett of Return of Empire Strikes Back and Return of the
Hmm.
Jedi.
Hmm.
These clones are also enhanced super soldiers that take Django's Mandalorian DNA and are enhanced with certain things to help them augment their survival, to focus them on fighting the enemy, but also to make them compliant. Like one thing that I think is really smart in Star Wars and in this episode of Star Trek is that one of the things the Argosians do is that they program these soldiers to be compliant to a certain extent. Like, unless they feel like they're in direct danger, they can't kill anyone.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
which to me is kind of, is even more damning for the Argosians because it's like, well, wait a second. You know that if you don't make them feel unsafe and you don't threaten them, you're not under any threat.
Yeah, and they've created a real problem for themselves by sequestering them on Luna 5. They've created they feel threatened by just
Well, like,
being confined there.
well, no, I mean the Argosians have created themselves an untenable situation where it's like you program them to where they're only threatened if they only
Oh,
kill if they feel threatened.
that's what I'm saying.
Well,
Yeah,
yeah, why did you even put them on this place in the begin with? But
exactly,
but
exactly.
this also gets into a larger conversation. Governments when they go to war don't take these things into consideration for their total calculus. Like human life is such a low priority that the idea of like soldiers being left behind in Vietnam or or veterans not getting their benefits from the VA is not even a worry to many of these people, unfortunately.
I think we've kind of handled this episode pretty well, and I just have one other question. Practical one is,
Yeah.
there's always emphasis, whether it's the current Biden administration or the Trump administration or the Obama, going back to, you know, Clinton after the Gulf War One. Um, there's always we've never gotten the VA, the Veterans Administration rights. We've never gotten things fixed. Why is that? Because we don't have the right leadership, or that we don't put enough money into it, or is a combination of both?
I think it's because they don't want to help poor people. Like the majority of the people that, especially among the enlisted that join the military, are joining for economic reasons. They want to, especially with things like the GI Bill that gets them things like that used to give them things like free college. Like you would be able to join the military, get skills on the job, serve your nation for 4 years, and then go to school for 4 years and literally walk out in a better economic situation than you walked
Well,
into.
well,
I think one of the reasons why they don't fund the VA, the reasons why they don't take care of our soldiers, is because they ultimately don't care about poor people. It's easier to keep extracting from the poor every time you need a war than to improve the situation of the poor, because at some point you're going to get to a war, and this happened. And this has continuously happened in our previous wars. If you educate the population, and if you take those poor soldiers and give them an actual education and make them question the things that they did, or make them question the wars you sent them to, it makes it very hard next time to send them to another war.
I think there's a lot of truth in what you say, because from being in tissue donation, organ donation, that sort of thing, there's very few transplantable donors that come out of VA hospitals, because these
Right.
people are so sick. They have multiple illnesses,
Right.
multiple comorbidities, and so forth.
Yes. Well, that's the other part of it too. Like the damage that these people have done to their bodies in the process of their service is so exorbitantly expensive under the current system that I think a lot of the government just doesn't want to pay for it because they don't want to have to be responsible for the bill.
Well,
Because it's going to be a massive bill.
it is, and part of it is not just any injuries that they received while they were in the service, but if they're not taken care of, they're not integrated back into society. And as you say, they remain on the lower economic spectrum, and they don't have access to health care. And now, as you mentioned in the beginning, we have this large uh, veteran homeless problem. Their health isn't going to be good. Once their health goes so far down, it's so difficult it's almost impossible to rehabilitate them, to get them back up to any level of decent health.
And to get to your question about why this isn't being dealt with, wait for another 5 to 10 years, and if there's another war, another conflict that needs to be solved, needs to be fought, like these veterans aren't even going to be remembered while they pull from the next generation of
Well,
the war.
it's kind of like if you had Biden, Trump,
This is why
Obama,
we got rid of the
Bush.
draft too. By the
Yeah,
way, like
yeah, I mean,
people realized that the draft was so damaging to a certain economic group.
yeah. Oh, yes. I mean, I think one question: if you had all the living presidents together, one of the questions I want to ask them is, say, gentlemen, and I'd say it like this, just like this, gentlemen, why the fuck, through all your generations over decades, have you not fixed the how we take care of veterans? And see what the privileged bastards say.
Well, it's become so obvious that there are. So Jon Stewart has a new show on Apple. The problem with Jon Stewart,
Hmm.
and one of the things that he did was talk about veterans who can't get their claims filled to the VA after they were exposed to burn pits. And what burn pits
We've
are
talked
is
about this,
basic.
right?
So basically, when you were out in the battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan and you needed to get rid of trash, they would build these huge pits out in the sand. They would put all the refuse in the pits, and then they would cover them with jet fuel, and then they would burn them. Well, you can't stand next to burning jet fuel, or else you're going to get horrific cancers. Um, and the thing is that the U.S. government ordered these soldiers who construct these burn pits, and didn't tell these soldiers the risks that they were getting involved in, that, hey, if you stand next to these while you're doing this, you're going to get cancer. um the truth is, if you just let veterans process their claims and, like, see the doctor they want to see and start, like, regular treatment like the rest of us do in that situation, like, a lot of this is truly, like, government bureaucracy getting in the way of our veterans getting treatment. Like, at the end of the day, it's some pencil pusher saying, like, we need to save money here at the cost of this man or this woman who gave everything for our country. That's the problem. And, like, there's no other way to get around it. There's no other way to really talk about this issue. It's just these bureaucrats.
Well, I think this is a good way, perhaps, to end the podcast.
Well,
Since
well,
this happened to occur on Veterans Day, 2021.
I'm glad that we did this on Veterans Day, and we're not doing the next episode, the High Ground, which is season 3, episode 12,
Yes,
because I'm glad we didn't do that one on 9/11, but we'll do that one
yes,
next time.
yeah.
But Dad, thank you so much for joining me. This was a
Thank you,
great
Jay. This
conversation,
was very good. Yeah, it was great.
and I'll see you soon.
All right. Bye. Good night.
Night.